hosted by Politics and International Relations here at Queen's University Belfast. As the stakes are undoubtedly high for Americans voting today and who have voted in the previous weeks, and it seems that folks around the world are paying attention as well, we wanted to offer our analysis of the election and to invite your questions to inform the discussion in the hour ahead. So I am Dr. Stefan Andreasson, and my colleague who has kindly set this event up is Dr. Chris Raymond. So Chris and I are both US-trained comparativists who teach and research on a wide range of issues that pertain to American politics. Chris is very handily an expert on elections, on party systems and voting behavior. I study US politics from a historical institutionalist perspective, one that is often associated with a field called American political development. And we have also taught the second-year American politics module together here at Queen's. So we'll begin this session with two brief presentations, one by myself and then one by Chris. You can listen along and then go ahead and please type your questions for us in the YouTube chat box or window where this is being streamed. Chris has promised me to field all the hard questions, and I'll happily take any easy ones if there are any. The other thing I should say is I don't see the stream. I don't know if Chris does. There's a 30-second lag between us speaking and what's streaming. So to avoid any confusion, that's how we're doing this. So that may expect if there's any kind of awkward lag or other interruptions, but hopefully you can listen along just fine. So what I wanted to start off with is to say a few things about the Electoral College and how a president in the US is actually elected. I do realize this is familiar information maybe for many of you who listen in, but we thought a brief primer on this would be useful. So what we have here is a map of the Electoral College and how many Electoral College votes each state and the District of Columbia get based on the most recent census in 2010. And as you may know, presidents are elected via this college and not by a nationwide popular vote. Hence, Hillary Clinton could lose the 2016 election despite getting about 3 million more votes nationwide than did Donald Trump. So the brief way to explain that is essentially that there are too many Democrats who choose to live in places like California and New York State, whereas the Republican vote is a bit more disaggregated across states, which allowed, in that instance, Donald Trump to eke out wins in more states and thereby get the majority of Electoral College votes. Okay, now the structure of the Electoral College has its roots in what's known as the Great Compromise, which was struck at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. This was fundamentally the compromise that allowed the states with larger population to reconciliate themselves with states with smaller populations in terms of a constitutional framework for elections that would suit everyone. So the result of the Great Compromise is the bicameral representation to accommodate, again, both large and small states that we've had in the United States ever since, whereby the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, is proportional based on the relative population of each state, 435 members in total, and the Senate today, based on 50 states, having 100 members, where each state gets 2 senators, right? So there's not a proportional representation. In fact, it's a very unproportional representation in the Senate or the upper house. Okay, there's an interesting context here as well around the issue of slavery and the 3/5 compromise and how you count inhabitants for the purposes of representation, but I'll leave that to the side for now. So what we have then is an electoral college today based on the 50 states, which has 538 members. So there's 538 electoral college votes in total. That is the 435 congressional districts, one electoral college vote each, plus the 2 senators, the 2 senatorial seats for each state being another 100 electoral college votes, and the District of Columbia, which gets 3 electoral votes, taking us to a total of 538. This means then that a winning presidential candidate needs 270, so a simple majority of these electoral college votes to win. If there's a 269 each tie, the decision goes to state congressional delegations who have 1 vote each, but that's hopefully something we'll avoid this election as well, so we'll leave that to the side. So the important point here is then that we have 51 discrete elections to elect the president, the 50 states and the District of Columbia. And importantly, in nearly all of those, the election works on the basis of a winner-take-all system. So whoever gets the plurality of votes in any given state, let's say Texas, wins all the electoral college votes in that state. And again, this is why we can have a situation like in 2016, where the person who gets the most votes nationwide does not get a majority in the electoral college. Okay, and again, the 2 exceptions to this rule are Nebraska and Maine, where a few of the seats are apportioned out according to congressional districts. So those are not strictly winner-take-all systems, but they also make up less than 2% of the electoral college vote in total. Okay, the other thing to say in this regard then is to re-emphasize the disproportionality of the system, which again stems from the fact that every state gets 2 electoral college votes for their senators, and that's equal across the states, irrespective of their population. So to demonstrate that, the easiest demonstration is California, which is the largest state with about 39 million people, has about 68 times the population of Wyoming, that has less than 600,000 people, which has 3 electoral college votes. So California, with 68 times the population of Wyoming, gets only 18 times the number of electoral votes. Again, California has 55, as you can see on this map, and Wyoming has only 3. Okay, so the other thing to say in respect of that is that this is why we have a discussion about the fact that the Republican Party today has a built-in or a structural advantage in the Electoral College. And people like to point this out because they note that it has only been in recent times Democrats who have been on the losing end of the stick, where a candidate who gets the most votes nationwide does not win in the Electoral College. And why is this? Well, this is because the system, as I just explained, disproportionately benefits or it intensifies the votes of the less populous states. And obviously, the founding fathers could not sort of envision how this would play out in party politics in recent decades. But the way it works then is that states with smaller populations are generally whiter. They have a higher proportion of white inhabitants. They are generally older. They have a higher proportion of elderly inhabitants. And they tend to be more rural in nature in terms of the geographic distribution of people in those states. And all of those characteristics are ones that tend to favor Republican candidates over Democratic ones. So that's why we talk about a built-in or structural advantage for the Republican Party. And this is why you hear in a lot of the analysis, for example, people saying things like, well, to really feel comfortable about being able to win the Electoral College, Biden probably needs to win at least by 5% in the national vote. That's a very rough number, but that gives you some idea of this notion that there's a built-in advantage here for the Republicans based on this disproportionality in the Electoral College. Okay. The other thing to say briefly then is that because this is by and large a winner-take-all system, again, except in Maine and Nebraska, we tend to focus on a relatively small number of states that are called swing states, which means that they could realistically go one way or the other. Everyone knows that Oklahoma and Arkansas and Mississippi will turn out a win for a Republican candidate, and likewise everyone knows that California and Massachusetts and New York State will be won by a Democratic candidate, as politics look in recent times. So those states are not in play. But the important states, again, are the ones that can go either way. And this is a map, this is the final map of the 2016 election, where Trump then won against Hillary Clinton with 306 to 232 electoral college votes, as you can see here in red and blue. And in that election, in 2016, while many of us looked at states like Florida and North Carolina as the pivotal swing states, we missed the big story of the day in 2016, which was what I've circled here, the upper Midwest, what was called the so-called blue wall, states that normally vote for Democratic candidates, but in 2016, somewhat surprisingly, voted in the cases of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin for the Republican candidate, for Donald Trump. And this is what swung the election in Trump's favor in 2016. So that is why, looking at a map here, which is the last electoral map that NPR published ahead of the election today, we see again what's circled here, a focus on that former blue wall, with the assumption being on the basis of polling this year that it will reemerge for Biden and take him to victory. So on their prognostication here, we see that even if all the swing states that are considered too close to call, which are the ones in yellow, would go for Donald Trump, Biden still has enough electoral college votes to win. What I would simply add to that is, to me, the big question mark here is Pennsylvania. And I think it's indicative of the importance of the state, just how much time the two campaigns have spent on Pennsylvania in the weeks leading up till today. If Pennsylvania flips and does not go blue, as is assumed here, then perhaps Trump has a real path to re-election. But okay, I think that's enough from me on the Electoral College and those aspects of the election. So I will switch this over to Chris to talk about a range of issues to do with the polling. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much. So what I'll start with are the national popular vote trends. That here I've taken data from Professor John Petrosik. He and I have been in close communication throughout the election cycle. And he has been taking all of the major national polls that have been conducted over the last several months. And he's tried to find what the average poll result is. And so taking into account a number of different factors, especially the timing in which this is conducted, and trying to find what the average of the polls is. And what he's done here, and I've taken these graphs that he's sent my way, he's compared the poll tracking that he did in 2016 to the polls that have been conducted in 2020. And if you see in the graph on the left, that there was quite a bit of volatility, that throughout most of the election campaign, Clinton had a pretty healthy lead, but it did swing one way or the other at a number of different points. And at the end, things tightened up quite a bit, especially in that last final week before the election. If we look at the graph on the right, which looks at the data over the same period of time for the polls that were conducted in 2020, since the beginning of the year, the race really kind of widened out, and Biden's lead kind of widened out quite a bit. And from there on out, from the start of the pandemic towards the end, it's been a pretty steady for Biden throughout most of this, that he's been somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% throughout the entire year. And while Trump had a significant dip in June and the 1st of July, he did pick up some ground, but nowhere near enough to be competitive in the national popular vote. And while there has been a slight uptick for Trump in the last couple of weeks, there's been a somewhat of a tip upward for Biden as well. And you can see it at the end of the graph on the right that the race still remains quite wide according to the average of the polls. So looking at these polls, 2020 does not look to be as close of a race in the national popular vote as it was in 2016. However, there's quite a bit of variation among the major polls that have been conducted. There's some major differences in the different companies that are conducting the polling. That several polls in the column on the left have got Trump closer to that 44%, 45% range that we saw on the previous graph. And here the numbers will be slightly different from the previous graph because I'm focusing only on the two-party share of the national popular vote. And so firms like the NBC Wall Street Journal poll put them at 45%, YouGov at 45%. Others like ABC and Washington Post closer to 44% of the two-party vote, meaning that Biden would get 56% of the national popular vote. Now, if you look at some of the pollsters on the right, you've got a number that show a much closer race. That Rasmussen and the Investor Business Daily polls have Trump much closer to Biden, 49 and 48% respectively of the two-party vote. And while these polls historically have shown Republicans doing better in them than others, they're not alone. That other polls by The Hill and Harris X have Trump on 48% of the two-party vote. Emerson have him at 47%. Fox have him at 46%. And if we look at the most accurate pollsters from 2016, and I have those figures in the right, in the parentheses, I have those underlined. The four most accurate pollsters, of the four most accurate pollsters, you've got ABC and the Washington Post, who slightly underestimated Trump's share of the two-party vote at 48% in 2016. So they're one of the pollsters suggesting an easy Biden win. But the other three closest polls in 2016, Rasmussen, Investors Business Daily, and Fox, Rasmussen being the absolute closest by fractions of a percentage point off. These three are in the column suggesting that we've got a closer race in 2020 than those in the left-hand column. So I'm not sure who's going to be more accurate here, but we do have some divergence. So the mean might be distorting our ability to perceive which way that this is actually going to go. If it's going to be a blowout, as the polls in the left-hand column suggest, or if it's going to be a much closer race as those in the right-hand column suggest. So regardless of who wins, somebody's going to have egg on their face when predicting the national popular vote. But there are a number of concerns with the polls, and here I'm not referring only to the national popular vote estimates, that there are a number of problems, especially with the state level polls. The national polls, as you could glean from the previous slide, are actually pretty close to predicting the two-party share of the national vote. There are a number of concerns with a lot of the state level polls from 2016 that may have carried over into 2020. And I'll illustrate some of those here. Particularly in the battleground states, in those very same states that Dr. Andreasson pointed out, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and I'd add to that Minnesota, had pretty significant problems in 2016 that significantly underestimated Trump's support leading to predictions that, especially in Wisconsin, that Trump didn't have much of a chance, but he ended up flipping the state. And part of the issue stems from the fact that we've been witnessing a slow realignment of the party's coalitions over the last several elections, and accelerated in 2016, that university-educated voters have gone much more significantly to the Democrats in election after election. Those with less than a university education are increasingly going to the Republicans. And perhaps as a result of this, the 2016 polls undercounted Trump's potential base of voters among those without a university education, leading to predictions that weren't borne out on election day. And so to solve this problem, a lot of the pollsters now are weighting their samples by education to correct for the fact that those without a university education are much less likely to participate in polls, whereas those with a university education are more likely to participate in polls, which could distort the numbers. And so to correct for that, we now weight the poll results by education to correct for any sort of imbalances relative to the share of the electorate that is caused by this. But that still leaves open a few questions that still plague us in 2020. And that is of a shy Trump voter who is, if they do respond to polls, might not be willing to answer honestly about how they intend to vote. We did see some evidence of this. The extent of this was unclear in 2016, but we did see some evidence of it. There are a number of factors that I'd be happy to get into that are leading some pollsters to say this is going to be a much more severe problem in 2020 than it was in 2016. Other pollsters saying this isn't going to be any bigger of a problem. But one of the concerns with the shy Trump voter is they might not only be less likely to answer honestly to the polls, but because a number of the sort of shy Trump voters are significantly less likely to participate in the polls, there may be some problems that could be exacerbated rather than corrected by the reweighting of the data. And unfortunately, we won't know until election day whether the corrections have completely solved the problem or further exacerbated the problem. And then we've got an additional problem posed this year by the fact that pollsters are struggling to figure out how to deal with the early vote. And that a significant share of the electorate participated in voting prior to election day, which on levels that we've never seen before. And one of the problems with this is trying to figure out who's actually going to show up to vote, because there are major partisan differences that have been in evidence for 4 or 5 months consistently in poll after poll, showing that Democrats have indicated that they were going to vote early. Republicans are much more likely to say that they're going to vote on election day. And so are we underestimating Trump's share of the electorate because we might see a huge turnout among Republican voters today, or have a lot of those voters already shown up to the polls? It's not clear. Adding this variable to the equation has made it harder to figure out how to address this partisan difference in who's likely to show up to vote. And because of this partisan difference between Democrats voting early and Republicans voting on election day, and because it's been so consistent in poll after poll, what we were expecting to observe was that Biden would get a significant advantage built up over the weeks leading up to election day, and would have a significant advantage that would be able to withstand the GOP surge on election day. But again, we don't know, because we don't know exactly who's going to show up to vote. So let me present a couple of concerning graphs here. Looking at the vote counts from as of yesterday evening, looking at a few of those battleground states. First, I'll start with Florida, a state where it was expected that Biden would make significant advantages on the early vote. But if we look at estimates of who has shown up to the polls based on the records of who has shown up, and the political parties collect a lot of data anytime you use a credit or debit card, you're generating data for them that is used to estimate how you're going to vote if you show up to the polls. Looking at those estimates of who's shown up in Florida already, Biden is currently sitting on 46% as of last night, according to this one estimate from a firm whose sole business is doing this. Trump is sitting on 46.9%. And so if Biden needed to rack up a significant lead in the run-up to Election Day in Florida, he did not manage to achieve that. Looking to the state of Michigan, again, another battleground. Here we did see an advantage built up by the Biden campaign. And so while we've seen as of last night about 60% of the 2016 total has shown up to vote either in person or through absentee postal ballot prior to Election Day, Biden is sitting on an advantage, according to this estimate, of 42.3% compared to 38.6% for the Republicans, and then a significant chunk of individuals who've just not been classifiable, at least sufficiently classifiable to put them into one column or the next. Again, if Biden needed to rack up an early advantage in the early vote, this raises a bit of concern in the state of Michigan. Turning to Wisconsin, another battleground state, same story as with Michigan. That here the advantage did not yet seem to materialize. Maybe those unaffiliated voters who've been too difficult to classify, maybe they've all swung for the Democrats. But the fact that they're too hard to classify raises some serious concerns for the Biden campaign. And again, we see advantages in these last two states. A big question for today is who actually shows up to vote. And so if Trump has a big surge, these two states could remain in Trump's column, again, putting him into contention for winning in the Electoral College. If, however, we don't see that Trump surge that the Trump campaign was hoping for on turnout on Election Day, then Biden might have enough to hold on to, or to rather take back Michigan and Wisconsin. And so with that, I'm going to pop out the chat here and if we can take any questions. So we've got one question so far, and I believe I know this individual. Are these total votes or percent chances of Biden winning the election that is accounting for Electoral College distributions? So if we go back a couple of slides, are these total votes or percent chances? Yes, these were total votes. Total votes in this graph here, but not yet allocating those who had indicated that they didn't have a preference as of the time of the sampling. On this graph, so I'll pop this out. On this graph, these are percentage of the two-party vote. So just focusing on Biden and Trump's vote, or Biden-Clinton's vote for the 2016 comparison. Turn it over to you. We've got another question here from Joshua. Coming back to what we discussed in class yesterday, how reliable do you think calling Texas a toss-up is? Well, let me turn that over to you, Dr. Andreasson. What sort of evidence do you see leading you to believe that Texas, or maybe you disagree with NPR's assessment, what evidence do you or others see suggesting Texas might belong in the toss-up category this time around?
Okay, well, you might have a better view on sort of the hard and fast data on this than I do, Chris, but I think we've seen a sort of general trend towards a kind of, I know it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but a sort of, an extension of the Austin effect to other metro areas of the state. So Austin being traditionally the state capital and sort of one liberal bastion of an otherwise quite conservative state. It looks like certainly in metro areas like Houston, if maybe less so in Dallas, we see some of that move as well. I think that what's tricky to me is that a lot of that debate seems to be predicated on the fact that the Latino vote will break very strongly in the favor of a Democratic candidate, this time Biden. And I know you probably have some thoughts about that, Chris, but that seems to me to be maybe the most important assumption behind all of this. So crudely put, as Texas becomes more and more Latino and less white, we will see it inevitably move into the blue column. But B, the difficulty with that assumption perhaps is that the gain for Democrats simply by the state becoming more Latino might be less than what is commonly assumed. I don't know if you agree with that, Chris, or not.
So one of the variables that a number of people have wondered as to its impact on this election is the number of Californians leaving the state for Texas. That moving van companies have run out of trucks to help people move from California to Texas. There are a number of reasons for that. But as a result of that, it's not clear how many Democrats were a part of that exodus. There's some evidence to suggest that was a significant component to it. And so maybe that might tilt Texas further into the Democratic territory. There were a number of polls that came out in the last week prior to the election suggesting that Texas was going to be a battleground state. There was one poll that had Biden ahead by a couple of percentage points. Looking at the demographic breakdown of those polls, however, the university-educated share of the samples were vastly disproportionate to the electorate in Texas. They're significantly overrepresented in those polls. And so I'm not entirely sure for that reason that Texas belongs in the swing state column or the possible swing state column because it has been Republican for quite some time. There's also the fact that looking to surveys over the last year, there's been a massive swing among Latinos toward the Republicans. Part of this is a demographic factor pertaining to the country of origin and cultural traditions, that you've got a lot of Cubans in southern parts of the U.S. Texas, it used to be historically a largely Mexican-American population, but in the last 4 or 5 years, you've had a massive influx of Venezuelans fleeing Maduro's regime, and they are none too happy with the talk of socialism. And you've seen, especially that latter demographic grow, and as you've seen that, the Democratic advantage in southern states like Texas has started to erode quite significantly just in the last 4 years. So for those two reasons, I'm a little bit skeptical about Texas flipping.
That's really interesting. And before we go to the next question, just very quickly, what I'd add to that, though, maybe in favor of this idea that, the state is, inevitably moving in the direction of becoming a blue state, is maybe the fact, which you might see as a sort of act of desperation, whereby in this election, some Republican legislators were attempting to get some, I think, 137,000 maybe votes in Harris County, which is the largest county, which is Houston, thrown out. These were so-called drive-through ballots where you could drive in and cast your vote and then leave. That attempt has now been dismissed by a federal judge, so presumably those votes will stand, but maybe this is one indication of the fact, not to put too fine of a point on it, that Republicans are running a little bit scared in Texas. Certainly it's not as comfortable for them as it used to be.
If we could go to another question from Kyle. Is the census data recorded this year likely to impact the amount of electoral college votes available in the next presidential campaign? I'll turn that question to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's every 10 years we have reapportionment. So some states will lose electoral college votes, the ones that aren't growing very fast. And the really fast, rapidly growing states will gain votes. And that means those states that lose and gain votes too, of course, will have to redraw their districts. And that's where gerrymandering comes in and all of those kind of issues. So yeah, we will have the next election contested on the basis of the 2020 census, which is why these censuses are politicized and important, of course.
We've got a couple of questions from Joseph, who first asks, what districts do we need to pay attention to in swing states? I remember after the 2016 election that they said 80,000 votes across 3 swing state districts changed the vote for Trump. And the second question, it was a common assertion that lower turnout for Clinton for minorities versus Obama cost her. Polls indicate Trump is gaining ground in minority percentage points this time again. How bad for Biden is this? Do you want to take that first?
I'm happy to do the second question if you're happier to do the one. I was thinking, Chris, you might have a bit more fine-grained knowledge than do I of not just what the swing states are, but how districts look, if possible.
Well, do you want to take the second question first, and then I'll come back to the first?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a concern. I mean, on one hand, it seems paradoxical because we know that Joe Biden swept to winning the nomination on the back of, in particular, African-American votes in the South, notably the South Carolina primary. But of course, a primary is a very different electorate from the general electorate. And I do think there's some evidence that young Black men may vote in slightly higher numbers for Trump in this election. Sure, that's from a low base, but even a small shift can have consequences in tightly contested states like Florida and like Michigan in particular, but also Georgia, North Carolina, and other states where there's a significant Black electorate. And as we've already discussed, I think the big question here is the Latino electorate. And that is, of course, today the largest that has surpassed the African-American electorate as the largest minority electorate. And I think there is where Republicans for long have seen their growth prospects among minorities to lie. And again, even if Trump, of course, won't get a majority of the Latino vote, he might do better this time around. And that indeed can prove very difficult in key swing states, not the least among them, Florida, for Biden.
Yeah, I would add to that. Biden had a number of gaffes over the summer that he botched an interview with Charlemagne the God that it should have been an easy one, but
yeah, that was not good.
There does appear to have been some fallout, and particularly among African-American men, that have not responded kindly to being told that by a white guy that they ain't Black if they have trouble deciding between he and Trump. And so will that hurt Biden in places like Milwaukee and Detroit and other cities like Pennsylvania, like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh? If that depresses African-American turnout, that could have an impact on those races. In terms of districts to look out for, well, one of the things about presidential years is that you tend to have a coattail effect, that congressional candidates will often find themselves elected on the coattails of the popularity of the president in their congressional district. Now, in the case of Biden, that might lead to the Democrats being able to hold on to the massive gains that they made in 2018. Trump's relative to any sort of baseline unpopularity is probably not going to win many districts in many states, apart from those where on the map shown earlier, we did well in 2016. That may help some races down ballot. In terms of swing districts to look for, if there is one district that I can identify, it would be and I'm going to blank on the exact number of the district, but there's a district in Western Pennsylvania that had a special election in 2018 that where there was a moderate Democrat who unseated a Republican in what was a very friendly district to Trump. And there's a tight race between the incumbent Connor Lamb and Sean Parnell, who's looking to unseat him on the back of Trump's vote. Additionally, you've also got a couple of districts, and Dr. Andreasson pointed this out earlier, because Maine and Nebraska split their votes. It could be the case that the congressional district for Omaha in the state of Nebraska could vote for a Democrat, whereas the rest of the state's electors go to Trump. And in the state of Maine, the majority of the state of Maine is very heavily Democratic, except for the second congressional district there. That district tends to be more conservative, and so we could see Trump steal an electoral college vote in the state of Maine, and Biden returning the favor in Nebraska. Apart from that, I'm not sure about too many of the district level races to pay attention to, but those would be the key ones I'd focus on. We have another question from Vivian. Hi, both. Thanks for this. Could you tell us more about the congressional races? How do you expect them to go? From a general sense, do you have any comments to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. I mean, the brief comment for me is that I haven't looked at it much. This might be not intended as a flippant answer about this, but Nate Silver and others seems to have the Democrats retaining control of the House at about 97%. I think there's a very strong consensus on that. So I suppose most of us have paid more attention to what happens in the Senate, where there's a real chance of a shift of control, and of course the presidential election. What I've seen is that the suggestion seems to be that the Republican candidates in the House who are contesting suburban seats in the larger metro areas where they still have seats. They lost quite a few of those in 2018, and evidence seems to suggest that might continue. So it's probably a quite difficult situation for more Republican House members than Democratic ones. I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Well, it's just the congressional race, looking at a generic ballot. So irrespective of the individual personalities running, asking if the election were held today, would you vote for the Republicans or the Democrats? There's been a pretty healthy Democratic lead, not quite as big as Biden's lead over Trump, but nearly that big throughout most of the year. So I imagine that House races will be fairly similar to 2018's outcome. And your point about the Senate is the one to pay attention to. We've got another question. I know you'd rather study the demographics aspects of the election, but how relevant may the legal aspect be? Both parties having armies of lawyers to contest ballots and results. Any insights on the legal challenges that we're about to see or likely to see?
Well, I think the comment here is well placed in the sense that indeed both campaigns have veritable armies of lawyers that are standing by and ready to enter the fray if we have contested outcomes across states and districts and so on. I think we're not likely, maybe we shouldn't talk about likely outcomes, but I suppose we're not likely to see a Trump landslide on the basis of the polls we've seen so far. If we see a Biden landslide, maybe it's the case that some of those points about contesting results in the courts become moot. But anything beyond that, any sort of slight lead or what looks like a slight win for Biden or Trump, and we're likely to get that contestation. And 2000 isn't that far back in time, where it took more than a month and a Supreme Court decision, of course, for the outcome of the election to be decided. And that specter of the Supreme Court, of course, getting involved becomes even more tricky this time around, given that we had the very controversial rushing through of a confirmation of a new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, just before the election, or in the middle of the election, you could say, as people are already voting. So I think anything that isn't a decisive win, and I suppose a decisive win is more likely to mean a decisive win for Biden, and we might have a very tricky set of circumstances to contend with.
Both parties have armies of lawyers chomping at the bit to argue the cases in all levels of the courts. And so if this race is close in any state, there will be legal challenges to the full extent of the law. So prepare for a long set of challenges. Another question from Connor. If the Dems take the Senate, do you imagine an increased use of the nuclear option to force reforms to filibuster, electoral college, etc.?
So could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Yeah. So if the Democrats take the Senate, do you expect reforms to the filibuster, ending the filibuster, any chance of reforming the electoral college through a constitutional amendment?
Well, okay. So the first question is, well, I mean, if I think, and it's just a prediction, but if the Democrats take both the presidency and the Senate and enjoy that a majority unified government across the board, I think those questions will die down. There are still significant risks to tinkering with those rules and regulations of how the Congress and other branches of government conduct their business. The other part of the question was
about the Electoral College.
Yeah, so the Electoral College, I mean, this is probably the amendment that has been spoken about and introduced more than any other to somehow get rid of the Electoral College and have a different system of electing the president, given that it seems very confusing to people, and certainly Democrats object to it, given how things have played out. But look, as you said, it requires a constitutional amendment, means 2/3 of states have to ratify, 50% of the states have no incentive of doing so because they are disproportionately represented. So I don't see that going anywhere. I think they would have to look at other ways of getting around that. So just as, making other decisions about how you allocate your votes. But I think the Electoral College is there to stay.
The only thing I would add to that is if we do have a repeat of 2016 in which Trump loses the popular vote quite significantly but wins in the Electoral College, expect more attempts to find creative ways to get around the Electoral College. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of attempt.
No, I agree. And again, it would have to be those creative ways because the amendment route is, I think, nearly impossible.
Another question from Samuel. What effect could attempted voter suppression and voter purges have in Republican-leaning swing states of Texas and Georgia, two states where Dems are relying on minority cities to win?
Well, there's a long and murky history of this, right, in American politics. After the civil rights legislation was passed in the mid-1960s, we got the Voter Rights Amendment in 1965 that was intended to protect primarily African-American voters in the South from attempts to suppress their vote. That Voting Rights Amendment was essentially hollowed out by a Supreme Court decision in, is it 2010, Chris? Holder versus Shelby County, but sometime around 2010 that was hollowed out, and the suggestion is that several, in particular southern states with large African American electorates, have again amended election laws with a view to, or at least that's the accusation, to dilute or somehow suppress or negatively affect the African American vote. And I think absolutely, to the extent that this happens, it could have a marginal effect that could tilt results in states like Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, certainly, again, all states with large African-American electorates, maybe less so in Texas. But it's a real issue. There's, again, it's a long and murky history there. And it's that could factor in indeed.
I'm excited to get to this next question because it's the one on everybody's mind. What about peaceful transfer of power if Trump loses? How do you think it will change the way the legal aspects of how elections are held in future in the USA?
Do you want to start on that one, Chris, or you don't have to?
I actually don't see him clinging on to power as much as a number of people are concerned. He's not the sort of person who takes well to losing. I don't see him giving up with a huge fight. Certainly the party is going to be much more interested than even he is. That the party is concerned with holding on to power even more than he is. It would be a big hit to his ego, but it'll be 2000 over again. The party machinery will come into effect because the party's very much tied to holding on to power, even more than Trump is. My concern is more the street level violence that we might see. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think the last point here, Chris, is for me what's really important. I think at the end of the day, this will play out if it comes to that, legally in the courts, and decisions will be taken accordingly on, the transfer of power, and we'll have whoever is legally deemed to have won the election installed come January. I don't have much doubt about that. But I do think, we've seen the specter already of, the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., boarding up shop fronts and so on in anticipation of unrest, and not only in Washington for that matter. We have the specter of perhaps, groups of heavily armed men, and I suppose some women as well, showing up at polling stations and all the rest of it. And we know the country is terribly, terribly divided at the moment, with a lot of guns in circulation. I think the statistic I've seen is that there has been, since the COVID lockdown, there's been 5 million new gun owners in the United States. That's about half the population of a state like Illinois. So that's a disturbing kind of context in which to have a contested election where there's no sort of immediate closure in terms of who has won and who has lost. I'll leave it at that as well.
Glad you brought up the point about 5 million new gun owners. That's added another variable to the equation.
And of course we've seen already, right? We've again, not all of this has to do with the election and Trump and Biden per se, but it has had to do with the responses to the COVID pandemic as well. But the plans apparently uncovered about attempting to kidnap Michigan's governor, Gretchen Whitmer, those displays of, again, heavily armed militia in the Capitol building in Lansing and so on. That kind of takes, I think, this election into certainly uncharted territory in modern times. I mean, we had a very turbulent set of circumstances around the 1968 election, for example, but nothing quite like it since, I would say.
So we've got a question regarding referendums and initiatives. I'm not sure if you've been paying close attention to these, but as with any election year, there are also a number of referendums initiatives in a number of states or districts. Are you aware of any interesting or enjoyably bonkers initiatives or referendums?
Help, Chris. This is one maybe for you. I have not really followed that this time. I mean, we obviously have, over the course of election cycles, some initiatives that end up being quite significant in terms of reshaping politics, sometimes locally, but sometimes nationally. But I'm not up to that this time around. So I don't know if you are, Chris.
The only one that's come to my attention is there's a referendum in California to eliminate legal restrictions for racial discrimination.
Right.
And that one is because there are efforts to try to engage in equity legislation that are constitutionally prohibited by California's Civil Rights Code. And so there's an attempt to remove racial discrimination from California law so that equity initiatives can be put in place. I was going to say, I have no idea how that's going to turn out, but I have seen one poll that suggests a plurality, at least as of a couple weeks ago, were not in favor of that one. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Anything you want to add?
No, not really, because again, it's just not something I've kept abreast of in this election cycle, really. I don't know if there are more questions. Otherwise, should we say something about the Senate, maybe? I mean, that's...
So we've got one more question.
Sure.
The number one issue in this election, according to Pew Research for the electorate, is the economy. GOP have traditionally owned this issue. Have this year's events changed this? Could it be long-term?
Okay. Depends on let's just assume if Trump loses, I suppose it'll depend on how the leadership in the GOP responds, what sort of leader figures emerge, let's say post-Mitchell at some point, and obviously post-Trump. But the one thing I'd say on this question is it's an interesting one, because one of the things that's confused me a bit, if I read this correctly, and you can correct me, Chris, if I don't, is that if anything, it seems that Trump has had quite a few disadvantages in terms of polling and public opinion and so on. But his handling of the economy up until the COVID pandemic hit, and maybe even in terms of some of the views on him versus Biden in terms of engineering a recovery, Trump seems he probably does better on those economic issues than on many other issues. Yet he seems to, relatively speaking, neglect those issues quite often in this campaign and talk much more about, for example, COVID, where I think people view his role and his responses and his leadership much more negatively. So it's been a kind of curious thing for me to understand why, relatively speaking, Trump has spoken so much about COVID. I mean, obviously it has to be addressed, but less maybe about the economy, where maybe he has a comparative advantage. But I don't know if that's a good answer, but I'll leave it at that.
So despite the pandemic's effect on the economy, in poll after poll, he still has a majority approving of his handling of the economy. And so I think that if he manages to eke out an electoral college win, it would have something to do with that he's still favorably viewed on that. And that's the one issue that he's led Biden on in any of the sort of matchups that I've seen.
No, that's a good point. So really, if we get a Trump win here tonight, despite the polls, it's maybe again back to Clinton's quip about it's the economy, stupid, in a slightly different context this time.
Shall we take one more question?
Sure, yeah, we have time. That's fine.
So from Samuel, if Trump loses, could the Republican Party fracture between the Trump wing and more traditional establishment wing?
Oh, I think we'll have a holy war and some mighty infighting if this is the end of Trump's presidency in terms of where the party goes from here. The GOP has, with relative rapidity in 2016, lined up behind Trump. That's been a very high stakes, I think, strategy for the party, looking at the longer term and where the country is going demographically and where the party has to make gains to stay competitive. So if Trump loses, I think there must be some sort of realignment. Exactly how that will pan out, I don't know. But yes, the short answer is there'll be a mighty fight about who is to blame and where does the party go next. That would be my sense.
I'll keep my 2 cents limited to 2 cents. That I think the establishment wing have either made peace already and have decided that the working class vote that Trump's appealed to, that's the future of the party, and those who can't get on board or couldn't get on board in 2016, they're lining up for jobs in the Biden administration. I don't see a return to 2016, pre-2016. I think the party coalitions have shifted already, and there'll be a fight, but it'll end up in a win for. I think this is here to stay.
Okay.
Any last thoughts you'd like to end on?
Not really. I'm just sort of, what I should say is I should say thanks, Chris, for organizing the tech setup and for doing this analysis with me. And thanks to everyone who is tuned into this event. I'm kind of eager to get back to the websites, as much fun as this has been, to keep following this through the night. I guess it'll be maybe a long night for many of us. But that's my thoughts. I would imagine, well, speaking for myself and maybe for Chris as well, that we're always happy to field questions from students and others who are interested in these aspects of American politics that we work on. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks very much, everybody, for attending. But we hope that this has been useful. Feel free to get in touch with either of us if you'd like to field any more questions. At least I know I'm happy to answer any questions anybody else might have. I see a couple more coming through on the chat. I'll try to respond to those here, but where we're at the appointed hour, I want to thank everybody for attending and joining us. Enjoy. Things are about to get crazy from here. So.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. And okay, bye.
Bye-bye.